over across environments, from one country to another, or across time, how things change over time. So we don't think there's something fixed in humans that at a given age you must look a certain way and behave in a certain way. We think that much of that is malleable, and we're interested in how things change across populations. So we're not really thinking of this as demography is destiny, your population is old, you've got problems. We're thinking that your population is old, you've got to adjust to the fact and adapt to the fact that you have a changing age structure, and you need to adapt your social structure and your policy structure in order to accommodate the new characteristics of the population. So that's the kind of research that our group does. As Randy Hall mentioned, we have an NIH-supported center on biodemography and population health, and a number of us interact within that group. We also have an NIH-supported multidisciplinary research training in gerontology grant that is in its 35th year. Vern Bengtson spent many years nurturing that grant, and now I am doing it, but I inherited it from Vern. We have trained generations of people to study aging with that grant. And they tend to study the social and behavioral aspects of aging, although there's some biology integrated into that. So today we have three topics to discuss, not four, because we are people who do populations, which mean we travel a lot. And one of us, Jack McArdle, who was going to talk about cognitive aging, was in Germany, and he remains in Germany, waiting for the volcano eruption to end. The other three of us were last week in Dallas with the rest of our colleagues, so we got home. We are here. We are integrated in a number of ways. Jack McArdle and I are co-principal investigators on the major population aging study in the United States. He does cognition, I do physical health. John Strauss is the principal investigator of two major grants that collect data that's comparable for Asian countries. He'll talk about that, and John Strauss and I work together on China, and he'll compare. He'll talk about China. I'm going to talk about the U.S. relative to Europe. And Merril Silverstein will provide an example of how what we're really interested often is in cohorts and not age per se, but how people of different generations change their ways of behaving at different ages. So that's the kind of thing that people who do population aging are interested in. So I'm just going to give a very brief talk about some work that I've been engaged in over the past year and a half. And I have been looking at American life expectancy and American health problems, and spurred on by the fact that I am a co-chair of a National Academy of Sciences panel where we've been charged with basically saying, determining what's going on in the U.S. And why is that happening and what can we do about it. And the reason is that life expectancy in the U.S. is not increasing the way we thought it once would. Randy Hall said, and Tuck said, that life expectancy over hundreds of years has been increasing on somewhat regular basis, but that's actually not true in the U.S. in recent years. Life expectancy is low in the U.S., and it has been getting worse relative to other countries like us, particularly for women. And these are the points I'm going to make. By any number of indicators, our health in the United States is also quite poor relative to other countries who should be like us. And part of the reason is our past and our present health behaviors, which we are now paying for some of our past, and we will pay for some of our current behaviors into the future. And we've actually, while we thought the healthcare system was going to blame for more of this differential between the U.S. and other countries, we've come to determine that we think the healthcare system actually in the U.S. does perform well in some areas and not so well in others. And that we also feel that health insurance reform, which we've been going through, will do little to improve the health in the U.S. So now I just want to show you some brief evidence that makes these points. This is a graph of life expectancy in any number of countries with the U.S. in the middle in red. And you see down at the end to the right, there are leaders in Japan, France, Switzerland, Spain, Italy, Sweden, Israel, Austria, Greece, Germany, all above us. And we are down here with the Netherlands, Costa Rica, Portugal, the United Kingdom, Cuba, Denmark, and Chile. We are not doing very well. There are a couple other countries like us. You can see that should be doing better, Denmark and the Netherlands. The rest of them, for a country that is the richest country in the world and spends the most on healthcare, you might think we'd do a little bit better. But we place very low in life expectancy relative to other countries, and the thing is, we're actually getting worse. This is the United States in red, and this is 1950, and this is 2000. If you look what's been happening, these are females, life expectancy at age 50. We have been deteriorating relative to the world leaders. Japan, France, Spain, Italy, Canada. We are below and we are dropping further. And you see there's been very little increase in female life expectancy over this past almost 30 years, which is something we had not come to expect. We thought we would constantly be on an upswing. We actually, when we look at other countries like us, we have more disability in the United States and we have more disease. This is a slide that shows the presence of functioning disability. It could use any number of indicators of functioning or disability. The U.S. is on the left, and the issue is the bar is the highest there. The other countries are lower, indicating a higher prevalence of functioning disability among Americans at age 50 plus. The same thing is true of heart disease. We have more heart disease than in other countries. And the same thing is true of diabetes. The only country that comes close to us is in the middle, the gray one, Spain, and that's because they are also quite obese. So in the United States, you can look at numerous indicators, and we come out worse than other countries. Now, there are some things that we don't look so bad in. So if we go around and we measure blood pressure all over the world, and we go around and we measure cholesterol all over the world, it actually turns out that Americans do not have levels of high cholesterol that are higher than European countries. They don't have levels of hypertension that are higher than European countries. But the reason is because we take so many drugs. That it's not that we were never diagnosed with hypertension or high cholesterol. We have the highest diagnosis of hypertension and high cholesterol in the world, but we also take the most drugs. So this is the use of drugs among men and women in the same sort of set of countries. The U.S. again is on the left, and this is antihypertensives, and we are far and above the highest users of antihypertensives. We are also extraordinarily high and pretty much higher than anybody in the use of lipid-lowering drugs. So because we use drugs so extensively, we actually have lowered some of our risk from hypertension and high cholesterol, probably relative to other countries. So it wasn't by our good behavior, it's by our drug taking. We actually have relatively low cancer rates of mortality compared to the rest of the world, with the exception of lung cancer. Lung cancer is worse in the United States. And the reason we have more lower mortality from cancer in the United States is we screen more than any other country in the world. We treat a whole lot of probable cancers, real cancers, and perhaps non-cancers in order to lower our mortality. So we have the highest screening in the world. it has resulted in relatively low mortality from cancer. So that's sort of a good thing, but if you'll get my gist, it's we do certain kinds of medical technology that we know how to do extensively, and perhaps we spend even more than we need, and other areas we may not be quite as good. So that's why we say the medical care system, it's not clear that's the problem. Our smoking behavior, interestingly, we tend to think of this as a thing of the past, but it hasn't left us yet. We were early adopters of smoking in the United States. Smoking pervaded our society for people who are now older, and we are actually paying a price for that past smoking. I think it's bigger than we perhaps once would have thought. We used to think if you stopped smoking, the risks went away. I think the data now are showing that's not the case, that actually past smoking is an important factor in our current low life expectancy. So if we actually eliminated the effect of smoking, we could raise life expectancy by women in the United States by about two and a half years, which would put us up much closer to the leaders in the rest of the world. So smoking is something that is still in the population. It's something that is not declining enough among women, and it still is, and we are paying a big price for that relative to other countries. Now, interestingly, we first thought that levels of obesity must be the reason that the U.S. has had such a modest increase in life expectancy. But what we've decided is that so far, in fact, the increase in obesity, which was quite significant, and we are the leaders of the world in obesity, has not actually worked its way through to raise mortality that much. It has only lowered life expectancy by about a half to a third of a year, which means that we believe obesity will play out in the next generation, not in this generation. And the reason is obesity is related to higher mortality if you are very obese and you are obese for a very long time. And that is what is coming in our population, not what we have already seen. So this is, if I look at three cohorts, these are birth cohorts, people born in 1919, there was very little obesity. This is the cohort that has passed through and whose life expectancy we've been looking at. 1944 cohort is actually only here at age 60 now. We can see already this cohort has a lot more obesity for a lot longer time than the cohort before it, and this is the cohort that's going to age into mortality. Now, the younger cohort, the 1969 cohort, is actually only observed here, and this is an estimate, but we can see this is where we're going to have a cohort that actually lives with a lot of obesity for a very significant portion of their time, and this is going to be a major push against increasing life expectancy unless we get rid of the effects of obesity on life expectancy. So, there's a couple other issues in the United States that distinguish us from the rest of the world. One is that inequality in health and mortality seems greater in the United States than in other countries, and that inequality appears to be growing in the United States. So, for instance, this is a quick slide with a data set that we collect for the United States, and that's the black lines. The bottom of the figure is wealth, and the issue is how much disease is there relative to wealth level. Heart disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer. We can see for heart disease, even this is people with $1 million in wealth, have higher heart disease in the United States. There's a relative to Europeans here, but that the biggest difference is in the lowest levels of wealth. And that's pretty much what you see across the board. So that says we have greater differentials in health and mortality by social status in the United States than in the European countries we're comparing ourselves to. The next slide says the differentials in the United States are growing. So this is a slide that basically has low education people and high education people, and it has 4 blocks of that, whites and blacks, men and women, and it has 5 colors of diseases. And this is change over time. And if you're above the board, you've actually had a increase in death rates from each one of these causes that's colored: cancer, listen, heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and pulmonary disease. And this is for low education. They've been increasing, white men. But for high education white men, they're decreasing. For black men, low education increasing, high education decreasing. Women, white women, a very, very significant increase in the rates of all these diseases for white women who have low education, and a very significant decrease for white women with high education. And the same is true for black women. So in the United States, we have had increasing differentials, which makes us, on the whole, look worse than in other countries. So the poor health in the United States relative to other countries results from a combination of smoking, obesity, economic disparity, and I have not talked about it yet, but unavailability of health care. Although we think the lack of health care is actually only a relatively small percentage, maybe 5% of the difference that we're talking about. So while universal health care might reduce some inequalities, we do not actually think that it is going to end up improving the health of the population of the United States significantly, that we actually have to pay attention to reforming health and doing health care reform, not just health insurance reform, if we want better health in the United States. And that better health in the United States is going to need to address a broader set of circumstances. We have to reduce basically our heart disease, level of heart disease, and that's going to require public health interventions as well as medical care interventions. So, thank you. Questions? Did you turn it off? No. Questions?
In terms of the disability, comparing the U.S. to other countries, I'm just wondering about, being an occupational therapist, I'm just wondering about the measures of that and the consistency of the measures. Is any of that possibly statistical?
I don't think so. We have spent years and more money than you want to think about in making those measures consistent. Those measures come from what's called the SHARE, which is a set of surveys from Europe, which have been done in order to be comparable. So it's the first time that we've actually had data from around many countries of the world that really are harmonized to allow us to make that comparison. So I believe it's accurate.
Go ahead. Of the countries that were ahead of us in terms of health, how many of those have some sort of have better access to health care than we do? Everyone.
That's easy. We're the only people in the world that don't have that. I guess that was your point. You knew the answer, didn't you, Cheryl? And some of them have much more active access to health care. I mean, in Japan, you cannot work if you do not have a physical every year while you are working. So it's not just available, it's forced on you while you're working. A lot of them have more emphasis on primary care than we do. So there are lots of issues about the kind of care.
Yeah, hi, I'm Pete Vanderveen from the School of Pharmacy, and I'm particularly interested in the medication use. My question is, do you account for, or can you account for, this large group of obese people that are coming through your chart, but are also receiving, lipid lowering treatment,
right,
blood pressure lowering treatment?
Right.
How do you factor that in? Because a lot of those things weren't around in the other cohorts.
And we actually believe that the effect of obesity, the link between obesity and mortality has been significantly lessened by the use of lipid lowering and blood pressure reducing drugs. And if you look over the last 20 or 30 years very carefully, you see a change in the coefficient linking those things over time. That's why I said we don't know about the effect of obesity until we actually know what the future of treating the symptoms of obesity are. We know it's connected to a lot of disease, and we know it's connected to disability, but the link between obesity and mortality has been lessened.
Eileen, do you have any thoughts on why Spain stands out in obesity? I mean,
They do.
Surrounding France and Italy and other countries are not. Why Spain?
Well, I think there's one, they either eat more or exercise less, right? I mean, that's the two-way it happens. No, not exactly, but we have noted that Spain is an odd person out. I will also note that if you pay attention to the Mediterranean countries, we've often thought about them having a Mediterranean diet, but it also appears that the Mediterranean countries have had a female smoking pattern in the past, which is no smoking. Very little smoking in France, Italy, Spain, among older women, not younger, but older. And that may have been confounded with their diet and thinking about what's happening in those countries.
Eileen, can you comment about your last point with respect to health care and public policy?
I think if obesity is, smoking is a problem, we all know smoking is wrong, but people still do it. So you have to have public policy that discourages people from doing it. The same thing is true of obesity. We know obesity is not good. We know exercise is good. But there do not appear to be appropriate incentives to make us actually behave in the way that's healthy for us. It is healthy for us to behave in a certain way, and it's cheaper for us as a country to actually use incentives to encourage people to behave that way. Now, things like, later on we're going to hear about air pollution. That's a clear public policy. That's not an individual variable at all. But there may be different variables like that that require us to intervene in a public health manner, not just medical care after the fact.
What about Denmark and Netherlands and United Kingdom? Why they are lower? I mean,
not everybody's bad in the same way. We thought Denmark and the Netherlands would be sort of the same as us, but it appears not to be true. The Netherlands spent very little money. They actually had a budget cap, and they actually, when they ran out of money, they stopped treating. That seems to be their problem. No one would say we should spend more money in the United States at all. No one thinks that we need to spend more to improve our situation. The Denmark is an interesting case in that it was illegal to actually you were not allowed to speak against smoking until the last couple of years because the Queen smokes. So they did not do any legislation, they did not do any discouragement, and now they're paying for it. They also did not pay, they don't screen very much for cancer. A lot of times they watch and wait. And they also did not innovate in cardiovascular disease. So there are a lot of specifics about each country, but generally we're bad and different for different reasons. No one exercises more than people in Denmark and the Netherlands. They worry when their exercise goes down in the population from 150 minutes to 147 minutes, and we're at about 27 minutes or something. So they behave well in some areas, but they've been bad on smoking also.
Your slide showed that education had an important relationship with health, and I wondered how that played out. Is it just education, or is it culture, availability to health care? How do you think the tie exists between education and health?
Well, I think it's both indirect and direct. I think most of it is indirect. I think education is a basic indicator of your social and economic status early in life, and I think social and economic status is a fundamental cause of differences, that people who are poor and have low education live different lives, and the lives are accompanied by less medical care, harder work at an earlier age, less treatment, and a variety of conditions that lead to poor outcomes.
Can you briefly discuss diet differences, influence?
I wish I knew the answer. We know there are diet differences, right? We know the most extreme differences would be between Japan and the others, and Japan looks the best, except for the things that Japan gets away with currently: high smoking, it gets away with high levels of hypertension, maybe related to salt intake, but clearly less saturated fat, and maybe that's the reason, but honestly we cannot determine if there's a specific dietary effect other than the fact that you are likely to gain weight with certain kinds of diets. And also, we can't separate exercise from weight gain either. And we think exercise may be more important even than the weight itself. So,
can you talk more about exercise?
No. I mean, we cannot talk, if we do not believe some of the comparative data on exercise. We know that some people exercise a lot, move a lot. Denmark and the Netherlands, people go to work on their bikes. That doesn't happen here. They walk to the train, they walk. Most other countries do much more movement in their daily life than we do. We don't score that badly when we look at similar cross-national questionnaires, but we're actually going to put accelerometers on people now across the world to actually measure better the amount of movement that people have in their daily life, since we think that is probably the hypothesis that we can't directly address enough.
I would like to bring the question of race. If you compare, of course, European countries being much more homogeneous, comparing Caucasians with Caucasians, do you still have the same stark differences in life expectancy?
Yes. And that's why I didn't emphasize race, because we tend to think that's our problem. There are major racial differences in the United States with the black population and the non-black population. Black population always looking less healthy and living shorter life. But if we look at the white population, we see the same difference between Americans and Europeans. So it is pervasive across our population. It's not just because we have a high immigrant or minority population. I'm not sure how this works.
Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I want to thank Dean Davison and Vice Provost Hall for organizing this conference. I'm very happy to talk with you today about the topic of grandparenting. When I say that word, I know what you're thinking. How nice a topic it is, how cute a topic it is. We all know grandparents or our grandparents who interact with their grandchildren in very fun-loving, very warm and affectionate ways. And this is no doubt true. What I call the Disneyfication of grandparenting, and this has been documented in many, many sociodemographic studies over the last 20 or 30 years, a movement of grandparenting towards something that's called companionate grandparenting. That is, grandparents who are fun-loving, who are entertaining, who take their grandchildren maybe for a day, maybe two, and then very happy to disengage from them. But I'm going to suggest to you that grandparenting actually is very important in terms of human aging, in terms of our biological history, and talk about briefly some of the biodemographic, evolutionary biological evidence from the social sciences and even from anthropology and biology that talk about grandparenting as one of our activities that historically for us has been crucial for our very survival. That is, long-lived, healthier grandparents were better able to ensure the survival of their grandchildren in more ancestral times, allowing those grandchildren to survive, grow up, and pass along those longevity genes to their progeny. This is somewhat controversial, but somewhat accepted within the literature. There's also literature on altruism, that is, altruistic grandparents, those who are willing to give as much as they can to their grandchildren, again, enhance the survival of their grandchildren, passing along some genes that might be associated with altruistic behavior. If you look at all the studies across the world, contemporary studies mostly, grandparents invest substantial amounts of both time and money in their grandchildren. If one believes that all actions are self-interested, this model doesn't fit the data. That is, grandparents give sometimes until it hurts. Often when they're caregiving for dependent grandchildren whose parents are unable to care for their offspring, this involves substantial investments of time at the cost sometimes of their financial and physical and social health. I'm not going to talk about those kinds of grandparents in this presentation, but I'm happy to take questions about them. Another way that grandparents are important, and again this is documented both in less developed societies and tribal cultures as well as modern societies, is that they're the harbingers of culture. That is, grandparents transmit to their children, of course, but also to their grandchildren, the kind of ideologies, the cultural resources that are necessary to survive in the world. Some of these resources can be normative actions, that is, how to behave in certain social situations. It could be something like how to cook food, something as simple as that, which could be very important in the jungles of Bolivia, for instance, where this has been documented. But cultural transmission in developed countries might take a more elusive form. And I'm going to suggest to you that, that religion, or religiosity, or religiousness, this is called various terms, might be one type of content that grandparents can provide to their grandchildren that could be functional for them. So I'm going to talk about the transmission of religious values and practices to grandchildren and ask several questions. Do grandparents influence the religiosity of their grandchildren, net or independent of the parents? This is something that hasn't really been investigated quite in that way before. And how is such influence maintained in some families but completely lost in others? That is, there's variation, we know, of course, to the involvement of grandparents, but also in the impact that they have on their grandchildren. So I'm going to talk about some contemporary changes that might be affecting this. To give you just a brief overview about sociology of religion, let's call it. Of course, America, the U.S., is quite exceptional in its religious orientation. In this country, religion and religious institutions are important in the moral training of children, and many children, if they don't go to religious services, might be trained in religion at home or go to Sunday school or some ancillary activities such as that. But many of our civic engagements are within religious communities and institutions. Often in the literature, these practices and beliefs are treated as individual attributes. That is something that you've come to yourself, your own spiritual awakening, perhaps. But these are characteristics or attributes that are embedded very deeply within families, and I'm going to talk about grandparents as one of those key actors. Socialization to religion and religious ideologies takes place in very overt forms, as I mentioned, Sunday school, going to religious services, but they also take place within the home. That is, formal training and induction into various ideologies. Families often coalesce around religious activities at milestone events. Weddings and funerals, of course, come to mind. And these can be very important in transmitting indirectly or implicitly religious ideologies and practices down the generational ladder. Now, that's not to say that religion has not changed in the United States. We know the religious landscape of the U.S., in fact, around most of the developed world, has let's call devalued or softened in terms of its adherence to a religious ideology or a religious life. And this is usually termed as the growth of secularism in our country. But also in terms of what we might call alternative spiritual movements, a move away from formal religion to something that's called spirituality, which is kind of a very vague, elusive concept, but seems real in much of our data. That is a movement away from formally admitting that you belong to religion X to something where you're now say, well, I'm not formally religious and I don't belong to a formal religion, but I'm a spiritual person. So how to make sense of that has been a challenge in a lot of research. I'll get rid of that. So the question is, has the family lost its ability to kind of anchor both children and grandchildren within a traditional religious orientation? Or are they still important? And this is going to be the topic of the research. Until relatively recently, grandparents were not considered important at all within at least sociology. Parent-child relationships were the dominant axis of the family that we've investigated, and grandparents were considered peripheral to the whole operation of the family. But increasingly, over the last 10, 20 years, grandparents are now being seen as important resources within the family. Qualitative research has shown that grandparents are a cultural window for their grandchildren, that is providing a basis for sharing stories about the family and about the belief systems that have been cascading through the generations. But owing to increases in life expectancy, as you saw in previous presentations, grandparents are now available more than ever before. That is, people are living longer, of course, which means that the relationship between a grandparent and grandchild could extend well beyond the adult years of that grandchild. And I'll show you a figure from Peter Eulenberg's work of, I summarize this as two different cohorts, one born in 1900, another born in 2000. And you can see the green line, the 1900 cohort. This is the percentage of children with at least one grandparent alive. So they both cohorts start out with 100% virtually of having at least one grandparent alive. But look at the precipitous decline in the 1900 cohort. So by the time that child reaches 30 years old, only 20% of them will have a grandparent alive, as contrasted with the more contemporary cohort, where 4 out of 5 will have at least one grandparent alive. And that grandparent is more likely, of course, to be a grandmother than a grandfather. So these are striking differences in just family structure. So we're not talking here about the content or the functions of family, but just in terms of availability. Grandparents are now around for their adolescent, young adult, and even middle-aged grandchildren. A study we did around year 2000, this is a national sample funded by the AARP to try to get a handle on what grandparents are all about. We asked a series of questions about what grandparents do with their grandchildren. And we made up these activities. This wasn't based on any pre-established notion of what grandparents would or wouldn't do, but we put in religious activities because it seemed like the right thing to do without any expectations. And we were surprised that over 60%, that's the yellow line, admitted to having sharing activities with their grandchildren that revolved around religious activities, however that was construed. So we thought something was up, that religion seemed to play an important role in family solidarity. So the study I'm going to show you is a more formal investigation of how those religious activities, principles, ideologies are transmitted, and we asked, do grandparents influence their grandchildren independently of parents? We also asked whether parents and grandparents synergistically, that is together, impact the religiosity of the grandchildren. When they're on the same page, does that make a difference? And then the crucial question about family change is, does divorce in the middle generation affect the ability of grandparents to transmit religion to their grandchildren? And this could go either way, of course. Grandparents could be more important when there's a divorce in the family because maybe they take over, or they could be shut out from the lives of their grandchildren and cease to be conduits for religiosity through the generations. So we look at this issue through what I consider a unique data set, the USC Longitudinal Study of Generations that was started by Vern Bengtson in 1971, funded continuously since then by the National Institute of Aging. It's a study that continued from 71 on to 2005 with 8 panels of data, and it consists of about 3,000 individuals in 374 3 and now 4 generation families in the Southern California region. What makes this study unique in one way, aside from the longevity of it, is that it surveys complete families. That is, grandparents, meaning grandmothers and grandfathers, all adult children, and all grandchildren over the age of 16. So we have complete family pedigrees in here to work with. And we added a 4th generation in 1991. 5th, hopefully, this year, because the G5s are turning 16 as we speak. This is a schematic of the study. You can see there was a 14-year gap between 1971 and 1985. And that's because Vern Bengtson put the questionnaires in the basement here in the Gerontology Center and forgot about them for about 12 years until NIA came to him and said, we want to do more longitudinal work. And he said, well, I have a cross-sectional study for you. And I just happened to have found the questionnaires with identifying information. And so the sample was followed up, and then for almost every 3 years to the present. The data we use for this, and again, I need to impress upon you how unusual it is to have 3 generations within the same study. We have the grandparents who are measured in terms of religiosity in 1971 when they were 44 years old. The parents we measure in 1988, or we take measures from 1988 when they're about 36 years old. And for the grandchildren, we take them in the year 2000 when they're 26 years old. So we lag this because we want to look prospectively, that is, toward the future from the oldest generation to the youngest generation. Because, of course, grandchildren can influence the religiosity of their grandparents, right? This is conceivably possible. But it's unlikely that a grandchild in the year 2000 will have influenced his or her grandparent in 1971. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but these are our measures of religiosity, and we try to be as complete as possible. That is, we divide it into practice. This is attendance of religious services. Salience, how important religion is as a value compared to other values in life. These are ranked among 13 other values. Religious identity, which is a simple question, how religious are you? From very religious to not at all. We also measure beliefs, which is the strength of what we call conservative religious beliefs. These are Judeo-Christian beliefs, and you see the statements here, and people can go from strongly agree to strongly disagree. What we did is sum up all of these items. They're all measured with different questions and different scales, and we create what's called the factor score. And the only reason that's important is because the statistics I'm going to show you later have better meaning when we use a factor score. So you can think of all these added up into one big pot as a religious factor. Now, because our data are clustered, that is, we have grandparents, and within the grandparents we have nested their children, and within the adult children we have nested the grandchildren, we need to use special methods. I won't bore you with that, but it's called, for those of you who know about these techniques, it's called hierarchical linear modeling. But the idea here is that the data structure is hierarchical, so our hypotheses are also hierarchical. That is, we hypothesize that grandparents influence the religiosity of their children, who influence the religiosity of the grandchildren. But also the grandparents are influencing their grandchildren through their adult children. So these are both direct and indirect effects. I'm going to show you a small schematic here to illustrate 2 families. These are not real families, red and green, just colors. We protect the anonymity of our subjects this way. We have grandparent red has 3 children, parent 1, 2, and 3, and within those parents are nested the grandchildren. I could not find any frowning faces in PowerPoint, so everyone's happy in our families, which is some sort of bias perhaps. And our grandparent green has 2 children, and within those parents are nested 2 and 3. So now imagine this 350 times, and this would be the structure of our data. So this is a simple way of presenting our basic results with all of other factors that we control for in the mix. That is, grandparent religiosity, we think, influences the parents, who then influence the grandchildren. But there might also be a direct influence of the grandparents on the grandchildren through whatever socialization process we discussed earlier. So I'm going to show you the results of this. And we do find, in fact, that grandparents influence the parents. Now, let me talk about these numbers for a second. Because I talked about a factor score, these numbers can be interpreted as ranging from 0 to 1, where 1 is perfect religious reproduction and 0 is absolutely no reproduction in religiosity. So you can see this as the strength of transmission going from 0 to 1. So grandparents influence the parents at 0.32. So that's fairly robust, and then the parents influence the grandchildren at 0.38. So it's a little higher, the correspondence. But the grandparents directly influence the grandchild's religiosity at 0.10. Now that seems small, 0.1 out of 1.0, right, 1/10, but it is statistically significant in our data. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that there's an indirect influence. That is, if you multiply 0.32 by 0.38, that's the indirect influence, and I'm going to show you the effects side by side here with the parent at 0.38. That's the direct influence of the parent on the grandchild. The grandparent direct influence 0.10, but the indirect influence of the grandparent through the parent is 0.12. So you can add 0.10 and 0.12 and get 0.22, which is the total influence of the grandparent. So 0.22 is not that far away from 0.38. Right, so both the direct and indirect influence seems to be fairly strong. 0.22 is about a fifth of the total scale that we're talking about, because it ranges from 0 to 1. So we do conclude here that grandparents are important, both independently in transmitting religion, as well as indirectly by influencing their children. Next question was about, do parents and grandparents work together to influence religiosity? And the answer is yes. What I'm showing you here, we divide up groups here into grandparents who are relatively low in religiosity, that's below the mean, and high religiosity above the mean in our scale. And then we look at the grandchild's religiosity on the vertical axis, and you can see the square that I'm circling is the condition when grandparents are higher than average, and also parents are higher than average. So when they're both above average, we get a super religious grandchild, right? And this maybe could take the form of attending church, synagogue, mosque together, whatever form it takes. When the parent and grandparent are both religious, the grandchild has an enhanced religiosity when they're working together. The next question has to do with divorce, which is the million-dollar question in much of the aging family research. How is divorce affecting families? We usually study this in terms of social support and caregiving, but in terms of religious transmission, we want to understand what's the role of grandparents as transmitters of religiosity in families that are disrupted when there's a divorce. And so again, this is showing you the lower grandparent religiosity and the higher grandparent religiosity group under two conditions. The blue is when the parents have an intact marriage, there's never been a divorce, and the red is when there's ever been a divorce. Now, there's a lot of complexities embedded within this, step families and so on, but this is a simple way to demonstrate it. And what we show here is that in intact families, there's a gradient. That is, grandparents who are low have low religious grandchildren. Grandparents who are high have higher religious grandparents. So you could see this as a correspondence within intact families, but the red line would be those grandchildren who have experienced a marital disruption in their home, a divorce in the parental generation. And here you see that there's low religiosity across the board. That is, those grandchildren, for whatever reason, coming from a divorced home, are not religious at all, but grandparents don't matter to them. Right? It's regardless of the grandparents' religiosity, those grandchildren in disrupted families still have low religiosity. So grandparents don't compensate for whatever it is that's acting on those grandchildren to lose or not have a religious orientation. So in conclusion, I would say that there is some evidence that grandparents are important transmitters religion. We can maybe widen the scope of this to say transmitting of a worldview. Religion, of course, is one way to make sense of the world. It's not the only way to make sense of the world, so we think that there are probably other ideologies that are transmitted that maybe are more global or maybe encapsulate a religion, and we're on the just at the beginning of being able to analyze that. Grandparents do not seem to compensate for the suppression of religiosity that's the result of divorce in families. That is, some of those grandchildren who were low in religiosity from divorced families came from parents with strong religiosity. But the grandparents are not able to overcome whatever it is about the divorce that has changed the intergenerational continuity. And then the last thing I would say is that religious orientation in our data is probably the number one factor that's transmitted, or the factor that with the strongest transmissible, with the strongest transmission across generations. This whole project started from, as serendipity usually works, from sitting around a table and looking at a 50 by 50 correlation matrix across generations. How do families in different generations correspond to each other? And we looked at political orientation, gender role attitudes, psychic sort of attributes like depression and self-esteem, maybe 20 or 30. And what jumped out at the page of us was the strong correspondence. The correlations were almost twice as strong for all the religious items that we looked at. And we thought this is something that seems to be important within families. It's hard to break free of your religious roots. Even those who protest their religious upbringing, they're protesting it, and that's an indication of acknowledging that this was something important, either good or bad, in one's life. So religious orientation is a strong thread through multi-generational families, but because of divorce, marital disruption, remarriage, step families, we think that thread might be fraying a bit. Now, whether that's for the good or the bad of the grandchildren or society, we're not quite sure. But I'm out of time. So I will leave you with that, and thank you for your attention. Yep. Any questions? Are there grandparents out there?
Sorry, I was curious about whether you were able to, statistically differentiate between direct grandparenting and indirect grandparenting. For instance, if you have a Bible-bashing grandparent, a Bible-bashing parent, and a child's Bible-bashing, how you can tell whether it's the parent's influence or the grandparent's influence that.
Yeah, well, we only know in sort of summary fashion how this influence works. We don't know at the extremes. We do know from other work that the continuity is much stronger when you call Bible bashing, but fundamentalist belief systems get to be reproduced in a much more consistent way over time. When we see the secularization in our study, and I should tell you that 1 out of 3 of the grandchildren report no religion at all, but many of them report to be spiritual or believers in various ways. But where that divergence occurs is when the parents and the grandparents are a bit wishy-washy about their religion. And so you see a divergence actually in both directions, but mostly towards secularism. But when we have very strong beliefs, it's hard to break out of those clutches, you might say, of that kind of upbringing. And so we see a lot more continuity when both are extreme.
Actually, it's not a question. It's rather a comment reflecting on the statement that grandparents can be a resource within the family system. My name is Yota Kureli, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I direct what is called the Foster Grandparent Program, celebrating this year its 45th year of existence. I direct about 35 older adults who come and mentor incarcerated youth. And whether they use their spiritual beliefs or their encouragement, their mentoring abilities in teaching them things about life, they have a great impact on the incarcerated youth. And the impact also that it's noteworthy is the physical health of the older adults. The ages are, right now the age dropped to 55. It was 60, but a year ago dropped to 55. And my oldest one is 88. And when they enroll in the program, which is federally funded, they get paid a stipend, their meal, their mileage. They might experience some physical health issues, and it's remarkable to see the difference as they remain in the program and they mentor incarcerated youth. So I definitely appreciated the research, and I will take any volunteers afterwards for my program. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, those programs are fabulous. And one of the other projects we're working on, and this is a project in China that we're doing on grandparenting in rural China, is trying to document the improvements in their cognitive ability, physical ability, and psychological well-being as a result of the caregiving experience or the child care experience in a more general way. It's very difficult to study in the United States because grandparents who are caring for their grandchildren come in with such an assortment of problems. But in China, the dynamics are very different, and we think that we could possibly detect some benefits. But certainly in the U.S., those without grandchildren would be prime candidates, or people who live far from their grandchildren in today's world, which is fairly common, could really benefit from a program like that.
How does race, ethnicity, culture, or generations in this country factor into your study?
Well, this particular study consists of 90% white non-Hispanics, but evidence, national data that we've collected and other people have shown a greater involvement among ethnic minorities. Sometimes this takes the form of being substitutes for parents, but strong cultural values toward what we call extended familism in Latino and African American cultures produces a larger investment, usually of time, less than money. Okay. Thank you.
So where do I push to?
That's backwards. And this is appointed. Okay. You introduce yourself.
Okay, so my name is John Strauss. I'm a professor in the economics department. My relationship to gerontology is largely through Eileen Crimmins, who is a PI and co-PI with me on a number of projects that we have in common in China. So I'm going to talk today about aging in countries, mostly lower income countries, that are undergoing the health transition. So this is a graph that shows life expectancy from birth by country and their per capita gross domestic product in log scale. There are 3 years here, 1930, 1960. This is called a Preston curve after Sam Preston, who first did this. And a colleague of mine, Duncan Thomas, updated this, and I updated this to 2004. And basically what this shows is a couple things. First, these lines going through the various dots are non-parametric regression curves. We don't have to get into technical details. But basically show that on average, the higher the income in the country, the higher the life expectancy. And that was true in 1930, it was true in 1960, it remains true in 2004. But then the other point that's quite obvious is that these curves shift upwards over time, which means that factors in addition to income are affecting and raising life expectancies. So there are going to be a myriad of factors, including better nutrition from scientific revolutions applied to agriculture, better education, better public health services and facilities. Okay. The other point that I want to make about this graph is that you actually see somewhat of a convergence. It's not complete in the sense that the biggest shifts upwards tend to be for lower income, particularly since from 1960 to 2004, tend to be for lower income countries and mid-lower income countries. Okay? Now, what I can tell you that's not apparent here, but those of you who understand demography will understand this, is that these curves are driven, the shifts upwards particularly, are driven not by improved survival rates of the old. It's driven almost entirely by improved survival rates of infants and young children. Okay? Aging does not come into this particular picture. But what this picture shows is that a lot of low-income countries have been undergoing basically a health transition, health and nutrition transition. And so a transition from, on the one hand, undernutrition and malnutrition, undernutrition, lack of calories, malnutrition, lack of other nutrients, to overnutrition on the one hand, and particularly from infectious diseases to chronic diseases. So in this school you know this, but this is a very important factor for many developing countries, many low-income countries, particularly in Latin America and particularly in Asia. In sub-Saharan Africa, you don't see this so much yet, with the exception in part of South Africa. So at the same time, and in part because, not in part, in great part because of the huge drop in infant-child mortality, you see the population structures beginning to age very significantly. So what this graph shows for a number of Asian countries is the projections to the ratio of working age population to older population from 2000 and then projection to 2050. And notice they all show the same thing. China's perhaps the most striking, where we're talking about a decline in the ratio of working age to older population from basically 13 to 2. So this has tremendous implications and worries a lot of people, particularly in terms of old age support, and particularly so when we're talking about countries that don't have the kind of social security system, public social security system, that we have in the West. So social security in most of these Asian countries is the family. And still that's the case. So this comes from a study that I've done with colleagues in China in two provinces, the richest province, Zhejiang, the poorest province, Gansu. And basically, just to summarize, what this shows is that for most people age 45 and older, they're either living with their children or their children live very, very close to them. 60%, 61% actually live in the same household as at least one adult child, and about 78%, if they don't live with them, they're in the same immediate neighborhood. And 90% have at least one child living within the same county. So that's quite interesting, and this is not necessarily true in other parts of China. I know Merril's work is somewhat different in some other parts of China. But in these two provinces, the decline in the support ratio has not yet manifested itself in terms of lack of support for elderly parents. So I'm going to talk the rest of the talk about, one of the parts of the nutrition health transition that's quite important in Asia is what's happened to body mass index. So basically what you can see in this figure is that in a variety of different countries, ranging from Bangladesh, China, Indonesia, South Africa, Mexico, and the U.S. Okay? So a country like Bangladesh, which is the poorest country here, the fraction of people, or the average BMI is low, and it's low for both men and women, although higher for women in general. Women are the red, men are the blue. But what's very different, this shows the relationship between years of education and a person's body mass index. So in the U.S. and Europe, we're used to the higher the educated person, particularly for women, the lower is your BMI. That's not true in low-income countries. It's particularly not true in a very low-income country like Bangladesh, where undernutrition, having a BMI less than 18.5, is particularly prevalent. But then the other thing, and Eileen made some points about this before, but you can see that Mexico has as much an obesity problem as the U.S., and so does South Africa, at least among women. That's not so well known, but it's true. What is true is that if you look at these curves, particularly the blue ones, which are for the men, for men in low-income countries, the better educated you are, the higher is your BMI. But for women, not Bangladesh, but starting with China, and then Indonesia, South Africa, and Mexico, you get this inverted U shape. So as women go from illiterate to some schooling, their BMI increases, which is probably good because they're probably starting out with very low BMIs. But then they get to a point usually a little above primary school where on average, of course these are just average relationships, BMI starts to decline, more like the U.S. Why it's going on with women and not men yet, we don't know. This is a fairly new, not a fairly, it's a very new finding. But just to show that the relationships between a health measure like body mass index and socioeconomic indicators can be very, very different in countries undergoing the health transition than in industrial countries. So these are figures. The rest of the talk is going to come from data that I and others have collected in Indonesia starting in 1993 and the latest wave in 2007. This shows cumulative distribution functions for body mass index for men and women aged 45 and older. And the main thing to notice is how these curves are shifting down, and shifting down very sharply over time. And what that means is, on the one hand, the fraction of the population that has BMI less than 18.5 is falling, but the fraction of the population that has BMI over 25, so they're overweight, is rising. And it's rising particularly so for women. So in particular, in 2007, for women, 30%, over 30% of women in Indonesia are overweight. BMI is over 25. When we started this survey in 1993, and it's longitudinal, same people, it was only 14%. So a huge increase. And on the other hand, the fraction of undernourished fell from basically 30% and almost halved to 17.4%. And a similar relationship for men. If you look at just the bivariate correlation between body mass and years of education, so it's upward sloping for men, and you start to get this sort of inverted U a little bit for women. But the thing that noticing is that this is shifting up over time. So even apart from education, there are other factors, partly income, partly other factors, that are changing over time, leading to rising BMI, even controlling for education. But on the other hand, for men, if you're better educated, your BMI is on average higher, and for women, the same, but the slope gets a lot flatter at higher levels of education. This is for waist circumference. So we know that controlling for body mass index, waist circumference is a pretty good measure of fat content. And controlling for BMI, particularly for women, waist circumference rose between 2000 and 2007. So fat content is getting worse for women here. For men, it's not changing nearly as much. This is all part of the health nutrition transition that this population is undergoing. For a different measure, hemoglobin, and this is for men and using a cutoff of say, 13, which is WHO cutoff for hemoglobin for men, you see that the fraction of men with low hemoglobin has actually declined. So this is another part of the nutrition health transition. So BMI is going up, and that's not good. Well, it's good for the people who start from very low levels, not good if you get into overweight and obese. However, this is very good. Low hemoglobin rates are going down, and Indonesia is a country that has had very high low hemoglobin rates, around 40% in 1993 for men. It's now under 30%. And for women, you see the same thing. Hemoglobin against years of education. The better educated you are, the higher is your hemoglobin on average. It's true for men and for women. And again, these curves are shifting up over time. Okay, we can look at things like the number of ADLs that a person has, a man or a woman. Here it turns out there's not a big change. The top curve is for 1997. For both men and women. I don't know why it was higher then, but then it comes back down. So it's really not a big change in number of ADLs over time, unlike for, activity of daily living. Thank you for asking. I sometimes forget the audiences. Thank you. Okay, this is a score of depression. The standard score of depression. The higher the number, the more depressive symptoms that you have. And you can see, again, this is declining with education. Better educated people tend to have less depressive symptoms, and women tend to have more depressive symptoms than men. Jack McArdle's not here, but this is coming from some of his work. So this is word recall. That's a typical 10-word recall, and then wait 15 minutes and ask again, and the average of that. And you can see very strong. Unfortunately, as we age, our word recall is going to go down. There's nothing much we can do about that, apparently. And on the other hand, very, very strong relationship with education. Okay, let me get to the final part of this that I think is quite important. So I'm going to talk about hypertension. We measure hypertension over time. And you can see there's not a big change, maybe a little bit increase for 2007, but not a huge change for women or for men. And hypertension, at least in Indonesia, China, it's also the case, not very highly correlated with socioeconomic variables like education and income. However, here's the punchline. And this is where these lower income countries are so very different than any of European or North American countries. Okay, so if we what should be more. Oh, thank you. Okay. So, in Indonesia and China, and there's another study in Mexico that was just presented at the population meetings, if you look at people who are hypertensive because we measured them, or they're on medications, and let's call those hypertensive, then separately we ask people, have they been diagnosed for hypertension by a doctor, by a medical, modern sector medical care person? So in Indonesia, 26% of men that we measure as hypertensive, only 26% have been diagnosed. Among women, it's higher, but still less than 40%. And there's some relationship to education. Better educated people have a little bit higher probability of having been diagnosed. In China, the numbers are a bit higher. They're about, underdiagnosis is about 55% in China, according to our China data. In Mexico, it's worse, though. It's 80%. So this is a case of underdiagnosis. And my speculation, although I don't have data from my own work yet, is that when we go to other diseases apart from hypertension, things like diabetes, it's going to be worse. So what this is saying is that the healthcare system in Indonesia, also Mexico, also China, is not set up to properly diagnose these chronic conditions. And why? Because it's still set up, these health systems, to focus on infectious diseases of young children. And as these countries are passing through the health transition, the needed investments in the health systems to get them better geared to health problems of the elderly, they haven't yet happened. And is one of the huge needs in these countries. And these are countries, Indonesia has no health insurance to speak of. Health insurance, by the way, in low-income countries, that's not a problem. That's sort of a made-up industrial country problem. That's not a problem. People can have access very easily to health care. It's subsidized for the poor. Health insurance plays very little role in all this in developing countries. But the quality of health care plays all the role. And that's the big issue. That's the issue in developing countries. I would argue it's also the issue in the U.S., but from a different point of view. And again, we have these data just show, and these data, again, have been repeated in China and in Mexico, at least. And these are much, much higher rates than we would find in the U.S. So that Eileen can tell us the U.S. rates. I forget them offhand. But 75% underdiagnosis for hypertension is very, very large. Now, last point I'll make is, having said that, there's still a so what question. And so what in the sense that, do we really know what the impact of hypertension is in these low-income countries? And the answer is no, we don't know. Let me stop there. Okay, questions? Yeah.
Was that self-reported?
No, absolutely no. It's measured. We take blood pressure readings.
Oh, okay.
So, John, when I look at Indonesia, they seem to be particularly poor health in some number of ways. Like their levels of anemia seem extraordinarily high relative to even other countries that are relatively poor. Why is that?
It's. I don't think we know. I think Indonesian medical system has always attributed this to diet, but I don't think we really know. That's something that so in the health centers, and particularly these village health centers called posyandu, which are geared towards mothers and young children, they have for a long time, a couple of decades at least, given out iron tablets. So this is something that has been well known in the Indonesia public health system for some time, and it had been like 40% below threshold levels for both men and women, but big change between 2000 and 2007, a big improvement. It's still high, probably in the low 30s, but a big change from 2000. And that's probably largely because of economic recovery in Indonesia, particularly between 2000 and 2007. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We can take a 15-minute break. Please come back